Hello, my name is Jacqueline Shaya, and today I'll be discussing with you my study, a descriptive study of diabetic retinopathy disparities among millions of patients. Diabetic retinopathy is a leading cause of blindness that affects 1/3 of the diabetic population worldwide. Not only does diabetic retinopathy affect vision, but social well-being as well. The prevalence of this condition is only expected to grow, with estimates of 16 million Americans being affected by diabetic retinopathy by 2050. The purpose of this study was to complete a descriptive analysis of diabetic retinopathy in the United States among tens of millions of patients. This was a cross-sectional design study with three specific aims: to evaluate for sex and/or racial disparities in retinopathy, to evaluate for sex and/or racial differences in A1C and BMI levels in retinopathy, and then to compare diabetic retinopathy in type 1 and in type 2 diabetes. This was a cross-sectional study that utilized Trinetics, which is a database that combines electronic health records from over 50 healthcare systems in the United States. At the time of this study, there were over 74 million patients in the Trinetics database. ICD-10 codes were used to identify type 1 and type 2 diabetic retinopathy, and data was gathered on demographics, BMI, and A1C. Prevalence and prevalence odd ratios were calculated to evaluate type 1 and type 2 diabetic retinopathy, and the chi-square tests were performed to compare the means of the A1C and BMI among different groups. All data was analyzed in September of 2021, and all control values were found through excluding the ICD diabetic retinopathy codes. Looking over at Table 1, we had the prevalence values of type 1 and type 2 diabetic retinopathy per 100 people. Overall, 9.2% of our population had diabetes, and of these, 6.6% had type 1 diabetic retinopathy, and 5.7% had type 2 diabetic retinopathy. Importantly, there was a greater prevalence of Caucasians having type 1 diabetes with retinopathy at 63% compared to type 2 with only 54% there. Among Black individuals, females had higher prevalence of type 1 and type 2 diabetes with retinopathy at a prevalence of 9 and 13%. If we move along to Table 2, we can visualize the A1C and BMI mean evaluations in type 1 and in type 2 diabetes with retinopathy. Overall, no significant differences were found among any of the comparisons, and this included sex and racial disparity evaluations. If we go to Table 3, we're looking at the prevalence odd ratios of type 1 and type 2 diabetes with retinopathy. For type 1 diabetes with retinopathy, Black individuals had 0.96 times the odds of retinopathy compared to the Caucasians with retinopathy. In contrast, in type 2 diabetes with retinopathy, Black individuals had 1.41 times the odds of retinopathy compared to Caucasians with retinopathy. When we evaluated for sex disparities, Black females had 1.08 times the odds of type 1 diabetes with retinopathy and 1.04 times the odds of type 2 diabetes with retinopathy compared to Black males with retinopathy. When looking at Caucasian individuals, females with type 1 diabetes with retinopathy had 1.4 times the odds compared to Caucasian males, whereas there was no sex difference for type 2 diabetes with retinopathy among the sexes for Caucasians. Lastly, when we compared diabetes with no retinopathy included, Caucasian females had odds of 0.79 for type 1 and 0.8 for type 2 diabetes compared to their male Caucasian counterparts. This shows perhaps a protective sexual effect. Overall, the prevalence of diabetes found in this study was 9.2%, which differs from previous reported literature of 1/3. There was a presence of a racial disparity in type 2 diabetes with retinopathy, with an odds ratio of 1.41 for Black individuals. The prevalence of type 1 and type 2 diabetes with retinopathy was greater in Black women compared to Black men as well. And the prevalence of both type 1 and type 2, just diabetes, no retinopathy, in Caucasian women was less than the Caucasian men. Further epidemiology evaluations are needed to confirm this race and sex disparity, and evaluate for ethnicity disparities, and also evaluate the incidence of diabetes and diabetic retinopathy. Then we can begin to work on effective ways of reducing these disparities, such as targeted screening programs, as early detection can help manage vision loss in diabetic retinopathy. Overall, there does appear to be a racial disparity for type 2 diabetes and a sex disparity for Black women with higher prevalence rates. of diabetic retinopathy.